Welcome in, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at anxiety.
Yeah, specifically, we're going to be looking at the book Hardcore Self-Help, Fuck Anxiety by Robert Duff.
I love that title. It's
Yeah.
so blunt and to the point. And yeah, this is a topic that we've gotten a lot of requests to cover, so we're really excited to finally be diving into it.
Yeah, and Robert Duff, I think he's got such a great way of talking about it. He's funny, he's relatable, but he's also really insightful.
Yeah, so before we get too deep into the specifics, just to set the stage a little bit for our listeners, we're not just talking about like everyday stress here, right? This deep dive is really about understanding anxiety disorders.
Exactly. And the thing about anxiety disorders is that, they can manifest in so many different ways.
Yeah.
So it's not just like, feeling a little bit nervous before a presentation. It can be really debilitating for people.
And Duff does a really good job in the book, I think, of highlighting a few different examples of that.
Yeah.
Like he talks about phobias, PTSD, OCD.
Right, and those are all very distinct things.
Yeah, like someone who's terrified of spiders, is having a very different experience than someone who's reliving a traumatic event.
Exactly. But they both fall under that anxiety umbrella.
Yeah, and that's, I think, why he stresses the importance of professional diagnoses so much in the book.
Right, because you really need to understand what you're dealing with in order to find the right treatment.
Yeah, and the wrong approach can actually be detrimental.
Oh, absolutely. The book actually talks about how untreated anxiety can lead to depression or even suicidal thoughts.
So it's really important to take it seriously.
Very much so.
All right, so we've established that anxiety is like this, diverse beast. It's not one size fits all. One of the things that I found really interesting in the book is when Duff dives into this mind-body connection.
Oh, yeah.
And he talks about how it's not just our thoughts that are causing the anxiety, but our physical responses play a big role too.
It's this fascinating feedback loop, where your thoughts can trigger physical symptoms like, your heart racing or dizziness.
Right.
And then those physical sensations make you even more anxious.
So it's just this like vicious cycle.
Absolutely. And he calls out this phenomenon called catastrophizing.
Oh, yeah.
Which is like basically, your mind just goes to the worst case scenario in every situation.
Oh, I'm so familiar with that.
Oh, yeah, we all are, I think. And it's like, okay, I have a presentation tomorrow. Suddenly I'm envisioning myself like completely bombing it, losing my job, ending up homeless,
It can spiral really quickly.
It really can.
Yeah, so how do we interrupt that cycle then?
Yeah.
Like once we're in that spiral of like, oh my gosh, my heart's pounding, I must be really anxious.
Well, Duff talks about a few different techniques, and one that I think is really helpful is the 4-7-8 breathing technique.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this. Have you tried this?
I have. It's amazing. It's like a reset button for your nervous system.
Okay, so for those who aren't familiar, can you just walk us through, like, what is that? How does it work?
Sure. So basically, you inhale for a count of 4, you hold your breath for a count of 7, and then you exhale slowly for a count of 8.
Okay.
And what this does is it really forces you to slow down your breathing.
Right.
And when you slow down your breathing, it sends a signal to your brain that everything is okay.
Interesting.
And it can help to kind of calm down that fight or flight response.
Okay, so it's not just about, like, taking a deep breath.
Yeah.
It's about this specific timing.
Right. The timing is important.
Okay, I'm definitely going to try that next time I feel myself spiraling.
I highly recommend it. It's really helpful. And Duff suggests, even practicing it when you're not feeling anxious.
Yeah.
Just so that it becomes second nature when you do need it.
Like build up that muscle memory.
Exactly. It's like a tool that you can pull out of your toolbox whenever you need it.
Okay, I like that analogy. And speaking of, building up those tools and those resources, Duff also talks a lot about the importance of relaxation breaks throughout the day.
Oh, yeah.
Like not just waiting until we're at that breaking point.
Right. Prevention is key.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's much easier to prevent anxiety than it is to try to cure it once it's already taken hold.
I think that's something that a lot of us forget about. We just kind of push ourselves and push ourselves and push ourselves until we're like, oh my gosh, I can't take it anymore.
And our society kind of glorifies that always-on mentality.
Yeah.
Which is really detrimental to our mental health.
Right. So it's almost like we have to be countercultural in a way and be like, no, actually, I'm going to take a break.
Exactly.
I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to meditate. I'm going to read a book, whatever it is that helps me to relax.
Self-care is not selfish. It's essential.
Yeah. And I love that, Duff doesn't just sort of like throw these concepts out there. He really gives you practical strategies and tools.
They are very actionable.
Yeah, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes you read these self-help books and you're like, okay, that's great. but like, how do I actually implement this in my life?
Right. It can feel very overwhelming.
Yeah, so it's nice that he gives you those concrete steps to take.
It's like a roadmap.
Okay, so we've talked about, breathing techniques, relaxation breaks.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Another thing that Duff dives into is the importance of communication and support systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is something that's really important to talk about because anxiety can be incredibly isolating.
It really can.
You feel like you're the only one going through it.
And oftentimes people who haven't experienced anxiety themselves, they don't really understand it.
Right.
And so it can be difficult to explain to them what you're going through.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to explain a color to someone who's been blind their whole life.
Exactly.
But they just don't have the frame of reference.
And that can make you feel even more alone.
Right. So what does Duff recommend?
Well, he has this really interesting suggestion. He suggests writing a letter to your loved ones.
A letter?
Yeah, explaining what it feels like to have anxiety.
I've never thought about it that way.
And I know it sounds kind of old-fashioned in this day and age of, texting and social media, but there's something about the process of actually sitting down and writing out your thoughts and feelings that can be really therapeutic.
And it gives you the space to really articulate it clearly.
Right. It's not like you're just blurting it out in the heat of the moment. You have time to really think about what you want to say and how you want to say it.
So it's almost like you're creating a guidebook for your loved ones to be like, this is what it's like for me.
Exactly. And it can also be a way to set boundaries.
Oh, that's a good point.
To say, hey, I appreciate your support, but sometimes I need a little space to work through this on my own.
Right.
So it's not about pushing people away. It's about setting those healthy boundaries so that everyone feels comfortable and respected.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to make. Because sometimes when we're struggling with anxiety, we can push people away unintentionally.
Right.
We're just not in a place to be social or to, be around other people.
And then that can make us feel even more isolated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So having that communication beforehand, I think, could be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Now, Duff's pretty clear in the book that sometimes we can't go it alone.
Right.
Sometimes we need professional help.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength to say, hey, I need help.
Exactly. And he talks about both medication and therapy as potential options. But he really seems to emphasize the importance of therapy.
Yeah. He sees therapy as a crucial step in addressing the root causes of anxiety.
So it's not just about masking the symptom.
Right. It's about understanding where the anxiety is coming from and developing coping mechanisms that are tailored to your specific needs.
Yeah, and he talks about how a therapist can be like a coach in your corner.
Exactly.
Someone who's there to support you and guide you through the process.
And to provide that objective perspective.
Right, because when we're in the midst of anxiety, it can be really hard to see things clearly.
Absolutely. Our thoughts can get very distorted.
Yeah, so having that outside perspective can be really helpful.
Very much so.
Now, one of the things that I really appreciate about Duff's approach is that he doesn't just focus on the struggles. He also emphasizes celebrating those small victories along the way.
It's so important.
Yeah. Why is that so important?
Because anxiety can be very discouraging.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up in the negative
Yeah.
and to focus on how far you have to go. But it's important to remember how far you've already come.
Right.
And to celebrate those small wins.
Yeah, because those small wins can build momentum.
They really can.
They can give you the motivation to keep going.
And to remind you that you are capable of making progress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not just about like, oh, I need to get rid of my anxiety.
Yeah.
It's about like, okay, I'm managing my anxiety.
Yeah.
I'm making progress. I'm moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. And that's a really important shift in mindset.
Yeah.
Because it's not about perfection.
Right.
It's about progress.
And I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about anxiety, because it can be a very long and winding road.
Absolutely. There's no quick fix.
Right.
It's a journey.
Yeah. So I love that Duff really acknowledges that and says like, hey, it's okay to have setbacks. It's okay to not be perfect.
What matters is that you keep moving forward.
Exactly. All right. So we've laid a lot of groundwork here.
We have.
We've talked about a lot of different concepts.
A lot of different facets of anxiety.
But one of the things that we haven't touched on yet is Duff's really unique approach to personifying anxiety.
Oh, yeah, Fred.
He actually gives it a name.
He does. He calls his anxiety Fred.
And I am so intrigued by this concept.
It's fascinating, right?
How does that actually help?
Well, we're going to delve into that more in the next part.
Okay, good.
Because I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, me too. It's a really interesting concept. And I think it can be a really powerful tool for people who are struggling with anxiety. Okay, so stay tuned, listener. We're going to be right back after a quick break. Okay, so we're back. And we left off talking about Fred.
Ah, yes, Fred. The anxiety personified.
I gotta say, I'm still a little bit, I don't know, is it weird to say I'm kind of charmed by this idea?
I get it. It sounds a little out there at first.
Like giving your anxiety a name.
Right.
Like, how does that actually help?
Well, think about it this way. When you're feeling anxious, it often feels like this big, overwhelming force.
Right. It's like this wave that just crashes over you.
Exactly. And it can feel very consuming, like you are the anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
But when you give it a name, it's like you're creating this separation.
Right.
It's not you, it's Fred.
So it's less I'm freaking out and more like, oh, Fred's acting up again.
Precisely. And that can be really empowering.
Okay, I'm starting to see it now.
It's like you're taking back some control.
Yeah, because instead of feeling like you're drowning in this sea of anxiety, you're like, okay, I see you, Fred. I know what you're doing.
Exactly. And you can start to recognize his patterns.
Oh, that's it.
Like, when does he tend to show up? What triggers him? What helps to calm him down?
So it's like you're becoming an expert on Fred.
Exactly. You're getting to know him. And the more you know him, the less power he has over you.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking back to like those breathing techniques we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like you have this weapon now that you can use against Fred.
I love that analogy. And Duff really emphasizes that the more you practice these techniques, the more empowered you'll feel.
It's about building up that arsenal.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And it's not just about like, fighting Fred off. Mm-hmm. It's also about learning to coexist with him.
Okay.
Because anxiety might always be a part of your life to some degree.
Right.
But it doesn't have to control you.
It's about finding that balance.
Precisely.
And speaking of things that can make anxiety worse, Duff talks a lot about the impact of our modern world.
Oh, yeah.
Like this always-on culture.
It's a breeding ground for anxiety.
Right. We're constantly bombarded with information and stimulation.
Social media, the news, our phones, it's never ending.
It's like our brains never get a break.
And that can be really exhausting.
Yeah, no wonder we're all so anxious.
So Duff really emphasizes the importance of setting boundaries.
Which is easier said than done sometimes.
It is. It takes practice. But it's so important.
Yeah. Like, what are some examples of boundaries that we can set?
Well, it could be things like limiting your social media use.
Okay.
Or setting specific times when you check your email.
Right.
Or maybe it's just, putting your phone away an hour before bed.
Create those tech-free zones.
Exactly. Because we need time to unplug and recharge.
Yeah, and I think that ties into what we were talking about earlier with those relaxation breaks. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not just about taking a break from work. It's also about taking a break from technology.
Absolutely. Because technology can be very stimulating.
Yeah.
And it can keep our minds racing even when we're trying to relax.
Right. So it's about being intentional with our time and our energy.
And making sure that we're giving ourselves the space to truly unwind.
Now, another thing that Duff talks about is the importance of connection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is especially important for people who are struggling with anxiety.
Because as we've talked about, anxiety can be very isolating.
Yeah.
And it can make you feel like you're all alone.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is you're not. There are so many other people out there who are going through the same thing.
Right. And that's why I think Duff's suggestion about writing that letter to loved ones is so powerful.
It's a way to break down those walls of isolation.
Yeah. And to start a conversation.
Exactly. And it can be really helpful for both parties involved.
Because it gives a person with anxiety a chance to really explain what they're experiencing.
Right.
And it gives the loved ones a chance to understand how they can best support them.
And it can also be a way to set those boundaries that we were talking about earlier.
Right. To say, hey, I love you.
Yeah.
But sometimes I need a little space.
Exactly. And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's not about pushing people away. It's about taking care of yourself.
And sometimes taking care of yourself means asking for help.
Absolutely. And Duff is very clear in the book that seeking professional help is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength.
Yeah.
It means that you're taking your mental health seriously.
And that you're willing to do whatever it takes to get better.
Exactly. And therapy can be such a transformative experience.
Yeah.
It's like having this objective, supportive guy who can help you navigate the maze of your own mind.
I love that analogy.
It's about unpacking the root causes of your anxiety and developing coping mechanisms that are tailored to your specific needs.
And having that safe space to just process everything.
Exactly.
And Duff talks about how, a therapist can be Like a coach in your corner. Someone who's there to cheer you on and help you stay accountable.
And to remind you that you're not alone.
And speaking of not being alone, Duff also really emphasizes the importance of self-compassion.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think is so crucial when you're dealing with anxiety.
Because it's easy to be really hard on yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Like, why am I like this?
Yeah.
Why can't I just get over it?
Right. And that kind of negative self-talk can just make the anxiety worse.
Exactly. So Duff encourages us to be kinder to ourselves, to treat ourselves with the same compassion that we would offer a friend who is struggling. And that can be really challenging sometimes.
It can, but it's so important.
Yeah.
Because when you're kind to yourself, you're creating a more supportive environment for healing.
And I think that ties into Duff's overall message of hope. You know, he's not saying that anxiety is easy.
Right.
But he's saying that it's manageable.
Absolutely.
And that you can live a full and meaningful life even with anxiety.
And that's a really powerful message.
It is. And it's something that I think we all need to hear sometimes.
Especially when we're feeling overwhelmed and discouraged.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about, different strategies and tools. But I think it's important to acknowledge that everyone's journey with anxiety is different.
Yeah.
What works for one person might not work for another.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. So it's about finding what works for you.
Exactly.
And being patient with yourself.
And not being afraid to ask for help.
Exactly. Because you don't have to go through this alone.
There are resources available. There are people who care.
And there is hope. Okay, so we've explored a lot in this deep dive. We've talked about the different types of anxiety, the mind-body connection, that whole Fred concept, and even the importance of professional help.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has. But now I think it's time to shift gears a bit and focus on some practical takeaways.
Yes, let's give our listeners some tools they can actually use.
Exactly, because knowledge is great, but it's the application that really makes difference. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways from Duff's book is the emphasis on self-care.
Yeah, he doesn't just say like, oh, you should take care of yourself. He actually gives you specific strategies.
Right, like that 4-7-8 breathing technique we talked about.
Oh, yeah. Such a simple but powerful tool.
It really is. And it's something you can do anywhere, anytime.
Exactly. No equipment needed.
Yeah.
Just your breath.
Exactly. And Duff also talks about the importance of regular exercise.
Oh, yeah. Exercise is huge for mental health.
It really is. It helps to regulate those stress hormones and releases endorphins, which have mood-boosting effects.
It's like a natural anxiety antidote.
And it doesn't have to be anything crazy intense, Even a brisk walk can make a difference.
Absolutely. Just getting your body moving.
Exactly. And speaking of things we consume, Duff also dives into the impact of diet on anxiety.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that connection before.
Yeah, it's often overlooked, but what we eat can actually have a huge impact on how we feel.
So what does he recommend?
Well, he suggests reducing caffeine and alcohol intake.
Makes sense. Those are both stimulants.
Exactly. They can really exacerbate anxiety symptoms.
So maybe swap that extra cup of coffee for a calming herbal tea.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the importance of eating whole, unprocessed foods and staying hydrated.
It's all about nourishing your body to support your mental well-being.
Right. It's a holistic approach.
I love that. And another key takeaway that we touched on earlier is the power of setting boundaries.
Oh, yes. Especially in our always-on culture.
Right. It's so easy to feel like we need to be available 24/7.
And that's just not sustainable.
It's a recipe for burnout.
Exactly. So Duff encourages us to be mindful of our time and energy, to say no when we need to, and to prioritize activities that bring us joy.
It's about creating that space for ourselves.
Both physically and mentally.
Yes. And that includes our digital space.
Absolutely.
So unplugging from technology.
Even for short periods can be so beneficial.
I know it's hard, but it's so worth it.
It gives your mind a chance to rest and reset.
And to reconnect with the present moment.
Exactly.
Okay, so we talked about self-care, exercise, diet boundaries, unplugging. Now, what about that letter to loved ones?
Oh, yes. That's a powerful tool for communication and self-advocacy.
It's a way to explain what anxiety feels like and to set those boundaries we were talking about.
Exactly. And it can really open up a dialogue with loved ones.
Yeah, because sometimes it's hard to put those feelings into words.
It really is. So having that written down can be really helpful.
And it can help loved ones to understand how they can best support you.
Exactly.
And if those personal support systems aren't enough, Duff also reminds us that seeking professional help is always an option.
Yes, therapy can be so transformative.
It's like having a guide to help you navigate the challenges of anxiety.
Exactly. And a therapist can provide personalized guidance, coping mechanisms, and that objective support that can be so valuable.
And finally, Duff encourages us to embrace a mindset of self-compassion.
Oh, that's so important.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to be hard on ourselves when we're struggling.
Absolutely. But we need to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a friend.
And to remember that progress isn't always linear.
There will be setbacks.
But it's about getting back up and continuing the journey.
Exactly.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive.
It really has.
We've covered so much ground.
And I hope our listeners feel empowered and informed.
Me too. Because anxiety is tough, but it doesn't have to control our lives.
We have the power to manage it.
Exactly. And remember, listener, you are not alone in this journey. There are resources available, tools you can use, and people who care.
So keep fighting, keep learning, and keep growing.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into hardcore self-help. Fuck anxiety. We'll see you next time.